In the last section, we covered the beginnings of post-processing, but it's quite a big area to look at, so we'll continue with that now. First up, we have auto exposure. So auto exposure is it's very useful, but it's also something you've really got to watch out for, because if you forget that you have auto exposure enabled, it can really ruin a scene. So the more I see this, the more I actually want to turn that dirt mask intensity down a bit to be a little more subtle. Yep, there we go. So when it comes to auto exposure, basically you've got a low percent and a high percent, which control how much of the screen has to be in darkness or lit for this to take effect. And essentially what it does is it automatically sets the brightness levels between one of two different levels. So if I control my minimum brightness level, I can now push it to here. And as I pull this back, the auto exposure is kicking in and fading down to a level that's equal to default lighting, whereas my max brightness level is going to push it further up. So if I was to tweak my max brightness level and lower the percent that it took to reach to hit max brightness levels, we would unfortunately end up getting this. I typically don't touch these unless I really want to. The main thing that I do work with is going to be my speed up and my speed down, which controls how quickly it goes from being accustomed to like a dark environment to being a bright environment. So these variables can be pretty useful. In this situation though, I would, oops, can't see that. So finding a nice point in the screen, 0.1, because it's kind of fading between them. There we go. So now I can clearly see it because it does very quickly. So finding a nice value for these, if it's dark, we want to set this to be the lowest percent with which you do it is going to be, let's say, 7%, and my minimum brightness is going to be, oops, 0.875. Oh, that looks alright. And max brightness, I mean, I could touch, but we're not really changing brightness too much. Auto exposure is one of those things that we're going to look more when we do an evening version of this map. So I'm going to leave those values where they are for the time being. And I'm going to reset the time it takes though, so that it's a bit more natural for your eyes to adjust. Lens flares, again on the list of things that are kind of contentious. If I do lens flares and we kind of get some going on. So to get lens flares working, I'm just going to click here and set an intensity value. I'm going to go with 5 for the minute. And I'm also going to select a bokeh shape. So I'm just going to click here and I'm going to type in the word bokeh. Now these are 3 textures that we have stored inside of the ArcViz folder. And now as I move my screen across, you can start to see the lens flares kind of kicking in there. And you can control how big these are and what kind of threshold it takes to get this. So if I wanted to increase the size, we can kind of get this more blurred out version kicking in. Whereas if I do this, we can kind of get these tinier. I mean, if I was going to do this, I'd probably go here and I'd change the threshold to be just very subtle. And I'd turn my intensity right down. Now they kind of pop in. Now if you want to as well, you can control the color of each one as they go through. These are the default tints and they work reasonably well, but again, it's kind of a situational setup, so if you do want to tweak them, go for it. Now the next is what I would argue is one of the most important areas of what we've been doing. I'm going to go ambient occlusion and I'm going to show you how this works. The edges of 2 surfaces, and anytime they touch, it goes ahead and adds this darkness into them. So if I look here at this corner and I set ambient off, whereas as I crank it up, now it doesn't just do it on these corners here, it's also going to do it on the statue. So for instance, if I look here, 0, 1, you can see it's getting darker inside here and in around these curves and stuff. Now, turning the ambient occlusion up is a thing that people are immediately going to want to do, but finding the right balance for it is also really important to get your scene looking good. So in this situation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first off set the radius to be in world space. If I go radius in world space and check it, the ambient occlusion extends up to 2 meters away in world space. So see, as I increase that, I'm controlling how far the ambient occlusion is willing to spread between surfaces. So I personally find kind of doing a tighter, more controlled AO at a lower intensity works reasonably nicely. That said, there are plenty of different ways to achieve this. So you could go through here and like up the power, which is going to result in this. So you can see it's at the inside of it, it's getting far stronger. That said, I personally prefer to kind of just work off the world radius, get it nice that way, and tweak the rest of it from there. So now that we've kind of got that looking all right for the initial pass, I might actually tweak that a little bit further. So quality, again, because we're ArcViz, let's just turn that up to 100, so that way we get a nice smoother transition. Before it was at 50, it's hard to see here, so I'm just going to turn the intensity up so you can really see it. 0 quality, 50 quality, 100 quality. So that's why I'm kind of pushing for a value that's around there. At the moment my radius is quite high, so I'm gonna drop to about 50. That way it's just kind of the edges of the room that are really getting highlighted, which I think looks alright. As I mentioned before, you can use the power to kind of control how strong this is. I'm gonna, instead of going for 2, I'm gonna push it up just a fraction so it's slightly darker inside of those areas. The other one that we can work with is bias. The bias is going to control where, like how it kind of creeps in and out of the corner. So as I increase it, you can see that the bias is kind of pulling back into the corner itself. So for this type of scene, I would typically use a bias of about 5. You can see this wall's now looking a lot nicer than what we had before. The MIP blend is basically, it controls how it actually blends into your light maps. So MIP blend, at the moment I've got it set to 0.6. If we wanted to crank it up a bit, we could, but I wouldn't go too far above where we are. I'm going to leave the rest of it all there, so that should be fine. Yeah, that looks nicer. Now we are getting a little bit of a weird effect around this post, which could be the result of a couple of different areas. Yeah, okay. So the reason for that kicking in so strongly was it's kind of at a perfect in-between area where at exactly 50 units away, it's not really calculating it very well. I could I could push the thing up to about 60 instead of 50, and it looks a little bit better. Yeah, it's nicer. Now, the next is global illumination. So global illumination is very, very, very useful. This is one of those areas that a lot of the time people are doing their lighting and they're like, oh, why doesn't it look good? And I'm like, well, you haven't set up your GI contribution correctly. And they're like, I don't know what those words mean. So here's where we cover that. If I go to global illumination and I go indirect lighting intensity, if I turn it off, this will immediately give you an idea of what's happening. Basically, this controls the level of your bounce lighting in the scene. So all of your lights are directly casting light into the world, and then they're bouncing. And this is what we use to scale how much of an effect that bounce lighting has on the rest of the scene. By default, it's 1. But I almost kind of want to push it up a little bit to about 1.25. It's just a little bit nicer. By the way, I'm really regretting having dirt on the screen for this because we're trying to go for something that was super clean. So as we go, I'm just going to keep turning this dirt mask down and down. That's okay. Okay, AO, global illumination. Okay, and the other thing we can do with the global illumination is we can tweak the color, which is really good. It's very similar to the temperature, except this is only changing the temperature of the tint of the bounce lighting itself. So if we want the prime lighting to always look the same, but we want that bounce lighting to have that slightly more, sunnier feel in this area, for instance, we can kind of get this. And you could achieve something similar by doing only the midtones and shadows of the other area, but this is, I personally think it works a little bit nicer for some scenes. So getting that kind of like slightly orangey look. Typically what I do is I get what I think looks good now, and then I dial it back because I know that in about 10 minutes time, I'm going to want to dial it back. So I'm going to get something that's just slightly yellower. So we get a slightly friendlier bounce light that kind of works with the temperature that we set up before. Yeah, that looks alright. Depth of field is one of those areas that, I mean, we can cover, but it's more of a cinema technique. If you're using depth of field and you're unfamiliar with it, essentially what you're doing is you're adding blur to areas that are beyond or before a certain region. If I was to turn this on, I could just set my scale to 1. Now at the moment this is what I'm seeing because my depth of field is set to render stuff that's really far away. But if I wanted to get my focal distance and tell it to focus on things that are at a specific point in the map, say something that is 2 meters in front of me, and then I set my scale to like 0. We now end up with like that blurring of anything that is beyond or before that region. Now, for something like this, it's not really the best use of depth of field. It is good when you're trying to mimic a real-world camera, or if you're doing a cinematic scene. So if I turn it on and off, you can kind of see it kicking in around the edges there. If you are doing a real-world scene or a cinematic scene, and you want to follow a specific actor, you can use that focal point as something that you're, following the entire time. It's something that I don't use too often in games though, unless I really, really need to. Now, after depth of field, motion blur, I mean, this kind of goes without saying, it just adds blur to anything that's moving around. It's not something we would touch in an ArcViz demo, so I don't really have an easy way to demonstrate it. MISC is screen percentage. So this is one of those areas that it helps a lot in VR. You're not going to see a difference when you're in the editor, but when you are working with VR projects, you can basically super sample them by cranking up your screen percentage to like 150, at which point you'll get a far, far better image in VR. It is kind of useless for us to use right now though, so I'm just not going to touch it. Screen space reflections are the reflections that we were seeing earlier. So if I do show reflections only, you can see that there are some reflections that are perfectly being calculated based on what I can see. And as those objects exit my screen, you can see that it's no longer calculating the reflection. So as I can see the block, it's essentially just working on a transform on the screen to kind of get that effect. And most of the time it looks really good, and your reflection actors kind of pick up the rest of it and nicely fade between them. In a demo like this, it's a good idea to push the quality up. So before it was at 50, but if I push it up to 100, we're just going to end up with slightly nicer reflections. The other thing you can set up is at what roughness level do screen reflections actually kick in. So for this kind of a thing, if I was to turn this up, I'm actually going to have to show you in a lit mode. So at the moment, if I look at this surface and then I decrease the required point for screen reflections, you can kind of see it kicking in. So once this roughness goes beneath a level, yeah, about 0.7 looks good. Again, this is one of those things that's going to be really per map. So you're going to need to tweak it as you see fit. Now the next thing I'm going to do, so blendables are if you want to add materials that are going over the top. If I wanted to add a cartoon shader or an edge detection shader, I would do it through the blendables. Other than that though, we've kind of covered the brunt of it. I'm going to kind of look at my scene as a whole and retweak a bunch of things that we've tinkered with. The first and foremost I'm going to tinker with is going to be bloom. I'm going to up the threshold with which things start to bloom out. And I'm going to set my bloom amount to be a far friendlier level. I'm actually going to turn it all the way down to like, there we go. I don't mind the lens effect kicking in, but I do mind the bloom being as nasty as it was. We're going to turn down my size scale for all of this actually. There we go, now we end up with that. The lens effects as well, I'm going to just go back through and just turn these things down. As I said, typically the first time you do something, you do way too much of it, and then you go back and just adjust. I know I've ended up with a scene that looks like this. I can still see some issues with what we've done, but for the most part it looks alright. Got a nice warm glow to everything. Up here is getting probably a bit too much shade, but it's still okay. The AO looks nice. Yeah, so look, I think that's probably it for the post-processing stage of this. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to go into Sequencer, and I'm going to start setting up a camera for when you hit play to kind of show off the world so people can see what you're doing and how you're doing it, etc., etc. In between now and then as well, I might also just do a couple of little minor tweaks to adjust the scene. The first and foremost I can see here is increasing the resolution of this floor, as this one's at 16, but these are at 32. So I feel like decreasing the res of the floor is going to give us slightly nicer shadows and match the environment just a little bit more. But otherwise, stick around, check out the next tutorial, and we'll start covering Sequencer.